That would be lovely. Welcome to our first of 3 talks hosted by Skojek to raise money for Aberdeen Jewish Community, Aberdeen Synagogue and Jewish Community Centre for their roof appeal. And we've got 3 fabulous speakers over the next week. And the first is going to be, very fittingly, speaking about the history of the Aberdeen.
Fiona, I think you need to mute everybody, otherwise we're going to switch over.
If you just heard me a second ago, I said I'm going to mute everybody.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Now I'll mute everybody. And then anybody who needs to speak, that's Nathan and Hilary in order, then you'll have to unmute yourselves when you do that. So I've muted everybody and I'm going to make it, we can make it that we don't want you to unmute yourself, but what we want you to do is, for the moment, what we want you to do is put messages and questions in the chat. So at the bottom of your screen, if it's a phone, if it's a computer, and on the top of your screen, I think if it's an iPad, there's a chat space for people to make comments, questions, ask all sorts of things that Nathan will answer after his talk. So I'm going to hand over to Hilary, who is going to introduce the cause, basically. Okay.
All right, okay. Right, hi everybody. As the president of the Aberdeen Synagogue, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining this virtual talk. Hopefully you'll find it really interesting. Aberdeen Synagogue is the most northerly synagogue in the UK. We're a traditional synagogue and hold services on the first Shabbat of the month, as well as all the festivals and high holy days. We've not had a permanent rabbi now for over 60 years. Our last rabbi was the late and much missed Harry Jacobi. Currently, we've got about 30 members, and the building is the focal point for the Jewish community. The building was bought in 1945 by the Jewish community after years of planning and fundraising. It's a 200-year-old listed terraced building in the centre of the city. Before the building was bought, the community used a rented room near the Aberdeen docks. We are celebrating our 75th anniversary of the synagogue this year, although the plans for our birthday party have had to be put on hold. Over the past few years, we've faced tough decisions about whether we stay in the building or not. We've had help from people far and wide, and we've come through our difficulties. And just when we thought the hard times were over, earlier this year, we found out the roof of the building was in bad condition. It was so unsafe that our builder refused to stop work, even though she knew we couldn't pay her. And again, we faced another tough decision. Do we fix the building or do we close? But we chose to fix it. So in 2 months, we've managed to raise 2/3 of the funds required to pay for the works. But, and it's a big but, we need a further 15,000 to complete the payments for the work. Skojek have been supportive over many years and offered to help us fundraise. This evening's talk and the following 2 talks over the next few weeks are part of the fundraising effort. So thank you, Skojek, and especially Fiona, for arranging this event. I also want to give my sincere thanks to Nathan, David Simons and Ethel Hoffman for giving up their time to help us raise funds. We hope that you enjoy the series of talks. Our first speaker is Nathan Abrams. Nathan is an old friend who has first-hand experience of the synagogue as he lived in the synagogue's student flat for some time. It doesn't quite look the same way that it did then, thank goodness. But hopefully you'll all enjoy the talk. So thanks very much and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilary. So over to Nathan. And I have to take out the spotlight for Hilary and go back to gallery view and find Nathan, and I will spotlight you.
Okay. Am
Yeah.
I good to go?
You're good to go.
Okay. I'll share my screen in a sec.
And Jean, can you make me host, please, so I can do the YouTube thing? Thank you. Sorry.
Yep.
I'm going to spotlight you. Right.
Hey, hello everybody. Great to be here. This is my first ever Zoom talk, and I'm very pleased to do it for Aberdeen Hebrew Congregation. I know that's not your official name anymore, but it was I enjoyed living there for the 2 years that I did, and but for a head of school at the University of Aberdeen who refused to give me a permanent contract, I might still be there today. Anyway, for the 2 years that I was there, I became interested in the history of the community because it hadn't been written about to any great extent, and that led to the what prompted it was the anniversary in 2005 of the synagogue, so of the opening of the Dee Street synagogue. So that would have been 60-year anniversary, and this year's 75 years, and that led to the what prompted it was the anniversary. Sorry, just hearing myself back there, and it led to the publication of this book. I can share the link. So Caledonian Jews, a study of, can't read it backwards, a study of 7 small communities in Scotland. And in this book, I looked at the communities outside of Glasgow and Edinburgh, so Aberdeen, Ayr, Dundee, Dunfermline, Falkirk, Greenock, Inverness, the Highlands and Islands. So and that was published a few years ago now, in 2009. The interesting thing is, despite the fact that actually I teach film studies at Bangor University in North Wales and have moved away from Scotland, Scotland keeps coming back to me. And last year I contributed to this book, produced by the Archives, the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre. But this might be another one. It's chapters on 14 chapters and all sorts of things to do with Scotland that you might be interested in. So I'm hopefully that will go to support the archives if you buy a copy, as opposed to my pocket. I don't think I get much from anything I've published. Right. So there's a little brief introduction. It's quite fitting. I'm in the attic or garret of my house here in Bangor, North Wales, and that's quite fitting given that I lived in the attic of the synagogue for the 2 years that I was in Aberdeen. I like to think that I did my bit through rent of helping the community to continue through that period, as well as the contributions I might have made by going to synagogue and whatnot. So, but let's get on to the history. So I think Fiona's indicated you can put thumbs up, thumbs down, Fiona, about half an hour. You can do the old when I've gone on too long. Yep. And I'm going to try and share my desktop here and switch to now I can't see you anymore, so can you all see that? I get a thumbs up if you can see my
Not yet. You need to press share.
Okay, yep.
Still not there?
Yep. Right, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, I can't see you now, so don't worry about that.
Just a hint: if people click on at the top of your screen where it says you're viewing Nathan Abrams' screen, where it says View Options, you can click on Side by Side mode, and you get to see the speaker and the picture if you want to.
I don't have that.
You'll do that.
Okay. Can you just indicate you can see an image now of the Aberdeen Jew, yeah? Oh.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Right, so I can talk about this book. This is a book I came across talking about the shared stereotype of the Aberdonian and the Jew. I'll leave you to work out the link there, but I think the text at the bottom explains it all. This was a book of jokes produced in, if I remember rightly, in the early part of the 20th century, and probably wouldn't be published today. Anyway, so just to give some history of what I came across in terms of the link between Jews and Aberdeen, there's been lots of rumours and conjecture about whether there are any Jews in Aberdeen before the 19th century. And there's been various accounts, all unconfirmed and unverified, of Jewish inhabitants to Aberdeen. In the 14th century, for example, there was a Thomas Phil Isaac, a Thomas son of Isaac, but again, no proof. Some other authors have talked about a Judaic colony in Aberdeen that was expelled, but we have no suggestion of Jewish inhabitants in Aberdeen prior to the last few hundred years, despite rumours of them. But I will turn to this one. This is interesting. This is a letter. You can read it. You can read the screen there. So Cecil Roth, the great historian of British Jewish history, places the first record of Jews in Aberdeen in 1665, when reports to the effect that a bark with silken sails and cordage manned by a crew speaking only Hebrew had been sighted off Scotland. What he seems to be referring to here is a new letter from Aberdeen in Scotland. You can read the title there. And in this letter that was sent to a person of quality in London, they purport to have witnessed a ship arriving in the port of Aberdeen, with sails, with white branch satin sails emblazoned in red letters with the words, "These are the 10 tribes of Israel." And then as the letter goes on, a large party of Jews dressed in black and blue and with stores of rice and honey. The professor of tongues and languages from the university was sent for, and he determined that the crew spoke Hebrew, and that those on board were bound for Amsterdam. Now, I'll show you some more images of this letter. Give you a chance to look at it. You can see on this on the right hand side about the tongues and languages, and on this page it talks about these are the 10 tribes of Israel and their stores of rice and honey. Now, there's two ways to approach this. Number one, we could say it's completely a work of fiction, and many of the metaphors, the sort of literary tropes we find in there, are common in fiction of that time in the 17th century. On the other hand, we could say it's true. Probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle, but it's been heavily embellished. I remember when I was researching this, someone pointed out to me that a ship with silk ropes and white branch satin sails would have never left the port. And in my naivety, I thought because they weren't seaworthy, and then it suddenly occurred to me what the person was telling me, that obviously such things would have been too valuable to have been left to sail off again. Anyway, so that's one of the more interesting connections of these rumours between Jews and Aberdeen in the 17th century. And if this was true, those on board were probably on their way to join the pseudo-Messiah, the Shabtai Tzvi, in the Levant, and would not have stayed in Aberdeen. What we can suggest, though, is that, probably, by all accounts, this letter is a work of fiction, the product of a then fashionable flight of a London imagination playing to a London audience, and using Aberdeen as a convenient location because its remoteness made verification more difficult. So in this sense, Aberdeen is used because it's far away and possibly to Londoners somewhat exotic. So we see no other mention of Jews in Aberdeen until the 18th century, when in 1732 there's a report that the 3rd Earl of Aboyne married Isabella, a Jewess daughter of Elias Levy, with whose relations he had a lawsuit in 1769. But that's all we know about that. Now, the next definite connection between Jews and Aberdeen is as doctors, and the important role of Aberdeen's two universities in medicine. And by the two universities, it was the two that eventually merged to become Aberdeen University, Marshall College and King's College. And what we see is between 1739 and 1829, 16 Jews graduated in medicine. They were largely foreign-trained refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition, and Aberdeen offered them a British medical qualification and a degree from a Scottish university that would have helped to enhance their standing and to attract patients. What we have to remember at this time is that England only had two institutions of higher education, Oxford and Cambridge, and they kept Jews out. In Scotland, there were more institutions of higher education. There's two in Aberdeen alone, so thus rivaling England in the number. But you know, if you think Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee, and so on. Well, not Dundee. I think St Andrews is earlier. And what these universities offered was an education on a par with Oxbridge, but there was open entry and religious toleration, and the fees and living expenses were relatively low. So this was very attractive for Jews, and so consequently the first Jews in the entire English-speaking world to graduate with medical degrees did so from Aberdeen. The first person to graduate was the converso Jacob de Castro Sarmento in 1739. But as we'll see, of the 16 Jewish medical graduates who took degrees from Aberdeen, all but two of them took their degrees in absentia. So another attraction for them was they didn't have to go to Aberdeen to study. It was more a kind of for a sort of they were vouched for that they had passed. So some other names of these doctors were Ralph Schoenberg, David Cohen, Gumpertz Lewisson, and so on. So as I was trying to explain, these degrees were conferred by recommendation from at least two patrons attesting the candidate's medical standing without written or oral examination. So although there's a connection between Jews and Aberdeen, we don't see Jews moving to Aberdeen. As a little postscript, two of the doctors turned out to be quack doctors. One of the affidavits from two Liverpool doctors for one of these individuals were possibly forged, and but he ended up making a fortune in Liverpool selling his patent medicine, the cordial balm of Gilead. He also sold a nervous cordial and sexually explicit writings on the dangers, prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases. Now, the first two bona fide Jewish medical students who did move to Aberdeen was, so here's some pictures, I jump ahead there, were Ernest Henriquez of Kingston, Jamaica, who came and graduated in 1898 and then left to practice in Lancashire, although his daughter Stella remained and studied in Aberdeen, graduating with degrees in 1923. So that's when we get the first kind of solid connection of Jews moving to Aberdeen, but again, this isn't a community as such. When we do see the kind of beginnings of a bigger community moving is in the 1840s. I mean, this is kind of true. We see the same thing in Bangor in North Wales, when, say, Jews from Germany or German-speaking Jews begin to move to the UK. And the Aberdeen Directory for 1840 to 41 listed H. Rosenberg and Company, manufacturing furriers and importers of foreign skins at 115 Union Street. We know about them. One of the ways that we know about Jews who move to remote places is through court cases, and we know about these two because they were accused of willful fire raising at their shop premises. And whilst we can't confirm that they were Jewish, this is Harris Rosenberg and his wife Alethea. Their first and last names certainly indicate a high probability of them being Jewish. Another Jewish person in Aberdeen at the time was M.A. Levy, a tailor, clothier and outfitter, who was listed at 26 Union Street during 1849 to 1850. Alfred Edersheim, born in Vienna in 1825, arrived in Aberdeen, but he converted to those of you from Aberdeen are now apart, really has its origins in the late 19th century, as with so many of these communities in the UK in particular, or on the British Isles in particular, as part of that huge wave of immigration that moves westwards from Central and Eastern Europe for a variety of reasons, whether it's to escape pogroms and anti-Semitism, or Tsarist conscription, or just simply to have a better life in the more industrialized West. And that's when we see the origins of the Jewish community. So by the 1881 census, we have several Jewish families. Isaac Barnett from Russia as a master picture dealer living with his 3 children. Myers Barnett from Prussia, same profession, with their children. Samuel Dreyer, and I could go on and reel off some more names. So we see the sort of nucleus or a kernel of the community in 1881. The Aberdeen Directory, another place that I looked to find Jews, lists such Jews as Alex Zamek, who would become the future president of the synagogue, and he's listed there in 1884 to 85, and he was from Poland and naturalized in 1887. So according to reports from that period, from the late 19th century, although religious concerns were central to Aberdeen's Jews, they were a small group, and I quote here, with very few exceptions, of the poorest class. So a synagogue was not immediately affordable. They may have met to worship in private or in somebody's home, but we don't have any evidence of this. And evidently, and as is typical with many small communities, I'd estimate there's a 10 to 15 year lag between the sort of origins of the community in terms of the people arriving and the ability of that community to raise enough capital to open up a building or to acquire suitable premises in which they can worship. So in the fall of, so it didn't happen until August of 1893. So we're talking, like I said, about at least 10 to a dozen years after we see the first arrivals, the first, sort of serious arrivals, as it were, when in 1893 they took the plunge and found suitable premises, and the first formal community, and the formal community was established on the 7th of September, when the synagogue was consecrated at 34 Marshall Street. And there's a shot of the building, at least as it was in circa 2004, 2005, 2006. I don't know if I think it was still there when I visited a few years ago. So what we have is as we can see, as typical again with small communities, it's not purpose built. It's located in 2 rented rooms on the first floor of this house at 34 Marshall Street, at the end there. And opposite Trinity Quay in the dockyard area of Aberdeen. It was described as, and I quote here, one of the lowest quarters of the town. A later congregant recalled the overwhelmingly fishy smell that would blow in off the North Sea. It cost £400, and because the congregation consisted of 8 members, of whom only 5 can be looked to for substantial support, the community looked to wealthier Jews in London and the provinces for financial support. The Jewish Chronicle at the time reported that the synagogue has been furnished in a handsome manner and presented a bright aspect. So no mention of the smell there. And as I mentioned, Alex Samek became the synagogue's first president of this congregation. And whilst I was living there, we discovered a whole bunch of notes and minutes and things in the airing cupboard, which were copied and with the Scottish Jewish Archives, and they have lots of interesting sort of details and anecdotes about the community. Not in its entirety. Some of them have been lost, some of the minutes have been lost, but that's where I got quite a bit of this information from. So a provision was made for a minister, the Reverend James Littman. Charitable and welfare organisations were set up to assist poorer Jews. And the General Assembly of the Scottish Church, who were trying to convert Jews, and poor Jews were always a good target for them, noted that Aberdeen's Jewish poor are well cared for by their own rabbis and the better off people. So this meant that they weren't as susceptible to conversion than perhaps those who weren't as well cared for. And we also see a keen interest in Zionism. A shekel group was formed, and Aberdeen's Jews bought 6 shares in the Jewish Colonial Trust, which was a financial instrument established by Theodore Herzl to promote colonization schemes in Palestine. We have the so then the next interesting thing that comes up again, like I said earlier, that one of the ways that we discover about Jews is through court cases, and shortly after the opening of the synagogue, the local branch of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals it was said that they had cruelly ill-treated and tortured the said bullock, fortunately for them, the judgment was dismissed. And obviously what the society was referring to was the method of shechita, of Jewish mode of slaughter, and the court ruled that this had been properly and skillfully carried out. So shechita resumed in Aberdeen in the following year, and not only that, a special delivery of Scottish beef was sent daily to London. Another little connection with Bangor, North Wales, is a surfeit of Welsh lamb was also sent to London from Bangor, kosher slaughtered lamb. I can talk more about that, but as time moves on. So, there's some discussion about whether that court case was motivated by anti-Semitism or actually genuine concern for the welfare of the animal. Then what we see in the next few years is, in terms of religious terms, is that Aberdeen's Jews, and it was alluded to in the introduction, couldn't always afford a permanent rabbi, so they had a series of visiting ministers on short-term contracts as a fairly typical practice in the smaller communities. And we see a succession. Littman stays for several years. He's succeeded by Morris Cohen, who's then replaced by Ahi Hershowitz, who's then replaced by Ostroff. There's I think that's the Jewish Chronicle for you. I'm trying to. There should be the advert for Welsh meat in there. There we are. There we can see the advert of a delivery of meat from Scotch House. By the way, as I can't see you, when you want me to finish. You're going to have to do it verbally, Fiona. So I'll leave that bit of information with you. So there's the advert.
That's fine. At the moment, it's still riveting. Thank you.
Okay, still. So you can hopefully you can read that. I can't make that bigger. Let's close my update from Haaretz. Right, we'll talk about these chaps. Right, so one of the reasons for this high turnover of ministers is the pay was notoriously low. It's been suggested by one historian that this reflects a lack of respect for religious leadership rather than the lack of simple funds. But what this meant was that those who were engaged as ministers in Aberdeen had to supplement their income by doing other things in addition to leading the congregation. So they had to kind of multitask. They had to be the minister, they teach the Hebrew classes, and they had to slaughter the animals, and they had to perform the circumcisions, etc., etc. I would make jokes, but I can't get any sense of reaction. So about one hopes they didn't get their duties confused in that respect. Now, the thing that really interested me, and that still interests me, is Aberdeen kind of is an outlier, not just geographically, but in British Jewish history, for remaining one of the few small communities that continues to survive as others are closing. I mean, I'm not sure what Dundee's official status is. I think last I heard they were very close to closing. I might be wrong, so I apologise if I've got that information incorrect. But as a formal community, the fact that Aberdeen still survives when really the only other communities and formal communities tend to be in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and we see the same in England. In Wales, there's only in South Wales, and Llandudno has a synagogue, but that's owned by Chabad, not by the community. So the thing that's always intrigued me is how Aberdeen has managed to survive and as a community, and it's had its ups and downs, but it's still sort of ploughed through. And the theory I sort of came up with was what we call a revolving door community, is that losses in terms of numbers were balanced. So outgoing numbers in terms of people who either passed away or left were not necessarily, they were balanced by incomers. So maybe not to the same extent, but there were enough coming in that a community services minyanim could be maintained. And whilst Aberdeen has never offered large-scale employment for Jews, and the community was never large, it's offered enough employment opportunities to attract incomers, and I think that's a part of the secret to its survival. It's not the only part, but part of it. So if we were to look at numbers in 1896 to 97, we're looking at 12 seat holders. Although the Aberdeen Journal reports 50 present at inaugural Jewish New Year services in September 1893, and the community was sizable enough to merit a visit from the then chief rabbi in 1896. By 1907 to 1908, the community almost doubled to 23 seat holders. But by that point, the 1905 Aliens Act had reduced the numbers of Jews entering Britain, and so this would have limited further growth in Aberdeen to internal migration only. In 1913, a cemetery is founded when a portion of the Public Grove Cemetery was sectioned off for use as a Jewish burial site. I do have some images of that, actually. I'll just flick through these. They'll come later on. I'll go back. There we go. So that was quite important, because up until that point, without a local cemetery, people had to be buried 150 miles away, which you can see creates its own issues. So the cemetery was secured in 1913 and continues, I believe, to today. I hope so. So to get back to this bit about employment, which is sort of what I wanted to move on to, is what attracted Jews um, to such a remote and isolated place in some people's eyes. I mean, not least because Jews tend to immigrate to urban rather than rural areas, and whilst Aberdeen's a city, it's it's not a huge city in the sense of some of the bigger metropolises in the UK. By the late 19th century, Aberdeen's a fair size. It ranks as the 22nd largest provincial town. Its population in 1871 stands at almost 90,000, and it doubled to 106, almost doubled to 163,000 by 1911. And its economy is based around a number of industries. Back then, paper making, granite quarrying, polishing, Aberdeen Angus, beef cattle rearing, and shipbuilding. But the city's main reputation by the late 19th century was based on fishing, hence the overwhelmingly fishy smell in the synagogue. And it's always been a thriving port, and from 1870s onwards underwent something of a herring boom. And Aberdeen herring became a mark of quality in the Baltic. In 1882, the fishing industry was transformed by the arrival of the first steam trawler. White fish stocks began to be exploited. So as you can see, as trade flourishes, there's a need for subsidiary industries, both to supply the supply chain to the fishing industry itself, but also to supply the workers in their other more general needs. So that's one of the reasons that would have attracted Jews to the area. And typically what we see is that Jews might start off as peddlers, wandering the countryside and then moving back to a base somewhere else. I mean, Aberdeen's probably a bit too far away to do that. We see it in Bangor, for example, where Jews from Liverpool wander in the countryside and then return back to Liverpool for the Sabbath. And then after they've accumulated enough capital, they move more permanently to Bangor and open a shop. Now we see the same in Aberdeen, although I wonder, in Aberdeen, would have been a bit too far to wander from somewhere else necessarily, although one could get the train. And again, all of this mass migration to the UK is facilitated by cheap steamship travel and then train travel. But when we see the congregation formed in the 1880s, 1890s, the majority of its members are self-employed, working at home or in backstreet workshops in crafts such as cabinet making, tailoring, shoe and hat making, petty shopkeepers, peddlers, hawkers, travelling salesmen, travelled widely to the villages of the northeast, selling their wares and returning home for the Sabbath. And their language and accents would have been a mixture of Yiddish, English and Scottish. Most likely these first commercial travels settled in Glasgow and other Scottish towns in the central belt, venturing north by train to Aberdeen, and like I said, returning home for the Shabbat. And they were seeking economic opportunities, and the competition in places like Glasgow didn't afford them. So if there's a lot of competition in Glasgow, you go off outside in order to make a living. And what we see is that there's a fairly homogenous occupational status until the end of the First World War, and that Jews were concentrated in a fairly small number of trades and retail businesses, tailoring, furniture, shoes, fish, clothing, fur and fruit. One of the more unusual occupations was that of the president of the congregation, Zamek, who was cited again in the court in 1896 as a Jewish usurer. And then we see that the community is boosted by the seasonal influx of commercial agents, particularly Jewish salesmen from Russia during the herring season. And so that's another way that we see Jews coming to Aberdeen, but they're not necessarily staying. One example of a family, as they're on the Skype call, is that some pioneering Jewish peddlers didn't stop at Aberdeen, but used it as a base for going
Now Nathan
More
sounds.
about that.
Nathan, we didn't hear that last bit.
Up to where?
The last couple of sentences.
Okay. I was talking about the Greenwald family.
Okay. If you unshare your screen while you're not talking to the screen,
Okay.
then
There
we
we
can.
go. All right. So, so whilst some people moved from Aberdeen, moved to Aberdeen, there were some who used Aberdeen as a base for going even further afield, and that includes the Harry Louis Hyman and Wolf Greenwald, who travelled from what is now Belarusia to Glasgow and then Aberdeen before settling in Lerwick. But you'll hear more about that in a future talk, I believe. So after they landed in Glasgow, they trudged along dirt roads to Aberdeen, attempting to sell jewellery along the way and picking up the occasional lift on farm wagons. And then they took the boat to Shetland, where they eventually settled. And we see others who made their livings trudging along the roads of Shetland, who also arrived from Aberdeen. Julius Quint. Again, find out about some of these people through court cases. Now, what I wanted to talk about was what the next slide referred to as professionalization. So this immigrant, this first generation, were in these kind of working class occupations. It was their children who kind of benefited more, and in between the two world wars, we see some. We see some. Share my screen again. We see some.
So Nathan has now frozen. Bet he'll come back soon. So Nathan's now frozen, and I expect he'll come back to us shortly. Wave to us if the rest of you can see us.
Fiona,
Yes.
I don't know very much about Zoom, but I do know that if you have a multiple one like this, there's a 40-minute limit on it. Would that be, and you have to reset it.
No.
Would that be the case for this one?
No, that's not the case for this one. That's not if you
All
have,
right.
not if you have a pro paid for one. But thanks.
Okay, that's fine.
Nope. It's another thing, which is that Nathan's internet isn't very good. Yay. So we've got some questions already down here. So I expect he'll be coming back soon. The questions that I've seen are, I'm going to put them in the chat again. The Chief Rabbi was a trustee of Aberdeen Hebrew Congregation. Do we have any thoughts as to why that happened? Did any members of the Jewish community hold public office in Aberdeen, and what contributions did they make to civil life? Did we come across a family called Bittimer Bootmakers? Fascinating. And then, so I'm going to put these questions down here for everyone, and then maybe some other people.
It looks like Nathan's back.
Nathan's back. That's great. Where is Nathan?
I'm here. Sorry, I got kicked out there.
Yay, welcome back. So can we see you
Um,
in the spotlight?
be able to.
Good.
I can see me and I can see you.
Great.
Um,
Can't see your face. If you don't share your screen, then we should be able to see your face.
no, it's gone into the default. No.
Yeah. Yay, we can see you. Okay. So,
Okay. I
anyone?
was about to, yeah. I was just about to show you some, just the hopefully
No, that's the Zoom you just
There we
shared.
go. Can you see a picture of a cinema?
Yes.
So what we see between the wars is the community becoming a bit more sort of bourgeois, a bit more well-to-do. Their children are able to benefit from university education, and they begin to branch out. And this fits into what I'm hired to do at Bangor, which is teach film studies. Ernest Bromberg opens, who was the proprietor of Aberdeen's first public dance hall, the Palais de Danse, situated in Diamond Street, not far from the synagogue. As an avid cinema enthusiast, he began to hold cinema-orientated events there from 1926, and he opened Aberdeen's first news cinema in September 1936 until 1963. Other Jewish professionals also arrive in Aberdeen, such as Bennett Teff in 1936, a civil servant in customs and excise. And I was going to show you this picture here, is because, like I said, as Jews became more economically successful, native Aberdonian Jews began to graduate from university in entering such professions as medicine, law, and teaching. But this then has a negative impact. But it has a positive impact in the sense they get more educated and the families move towards the more affluent West End of Aberdeen. But the negative side of it is that these Jews with degrees begin to move away. We do see during the just before the Depression from 1927 onwards, some American Jews who are unable to gain places in medical schools in the United States because of anti-Semitic quotas began to study in Aberdeen. And between 1928 and 1930, we see 11 Americans were admitted. They were virtually all graduates of either New York University or the City College of New York, the Jewish university. And we see some from South Africa, but they only stay temporarily and return home, sometimes taking Scottish brides with them. So the character of the community in religious terms is by and large East European Ashkenazi. There's never been a strong, there have been Sephardim in Aberdeen, but it's never been a kind of Sephardic community as such. We see just before World War II, after the...
Can you turn off your sharing when you're not talking about this picture, because it's nicer to see you, please.
Okay. I think you're the first person to ever say that. So what we see in 1936 is a trickle of German Jews begin to come to Aberdeen. In 1938, the Aberdeen Refugee Committee was established and instrumental in bringing a number of Jewish families to Aberdeen. One of those was some of those were the Kress family. Other notable figures include the eminent philosopher Emil Fackenheim and his father Julius, very famous post-Holocaust philosopher, Emil Fackenheim. He spent 2 years in Aberdeen and apparently picked up a distinctive brogue which he never lost for the rest of his life. We see others, Peter Landsberg, Rudolf Schlesinger, and the educators Kurt Hahn, Karl Koenig, amongst others. And they set up the Gordonston School, founded by Kurt Hahn, which I'm sure you all know about. And if you didn't, I'm sure you've seen it in The Crown. And the Camp Hill Rudolf Steiner schools were established by Karl Koenig just outside Aberdeen. So another interesting sort of connection there with the history. What I was going to move on to was, if I share my screen here, is so in 1945, the community has grown to such an extent that a new building is warranted. And part of the reason for the growth of the community during World War II were evacuees, refugees, and other military personnel who are either moved to Aberdeen or nearby, and we see a boost in the numbers of the community as Jewish service personnel who are in some of the numerous bases in and around Aberdeen and North East Scotland are invited to synagogue services and into people's homes, such as Ernest Bromberg's dance hall. Obviously this led to liaisons between the service personnel and members of the local community. But as we see by 1945, by the end of the war, the community had grown, that had outgrown the building in Marshall Street, and had become wealthier, for the reasons I mentioned. So they acquire the current building, which was described in the introduction, and that was at 74 Dee Street, and that was consecrated, as you can see, on 6 June 1945. You can see the opening of the order of service there. What I find fascinating, as you see this through accounts of synagogue services, is that they attract a lot of interest in the local press, and non-Jews often show an interest in attending. And there's usually a long description in the local paper. So that's where we've got quite a bit of detail about that. And again, the kind of vibrant cultural, social cultural, as well as religious life continues post-war, and we see a literary and social society, a Wheatso, a ladies' guild, and amongst other things, are set up in the post-war era. The first permanent rabbi was established in 1956, and this is a rarity for a small community. And the Aberdeen appointee was Dr. Gustav Pfingst, who was from Germany, who studied under Rabbi Leo Beck. I'll share that. So there's another picture from the opening of this picture of my dog, of the opening of the synagogue. So you can see the dignitaries in their top hats. Here's another image from the opening of the synagogue, which I believe was taken upstairs in the synagogue. I believe this photo was supplied by one of those of you in the Zoom call, if you recognize yourself in there. And there's an example of the Seder that I believe this is you, Pauline Terrett, in there. And you supplied this to me probably at least a decade ago now. Is that you there?
You have to unmute yourself, Pauline.
I think it's you, Pauline. I might be wrong. But this is the Seder. You see, very nice, lavish affair, no plastic. Held upstairs in the synagogue, and an example of this of this communal life that we see in Aberdeen in the post-war era. So in terms of numbers, by 1965, the population of Aberdeen is 85, and I think that the Jewish population of Aberdeen, 8 of those were children, and they're being taught in Hebrew classes. And then we see various people sort of coming and going in the decades in the decades since. So we have Phil and Sarah Orkin from Canada. Phil taught zoology at the University of Aberdeen, while Sarah was the first registered dietitian in the city. They led the services and the seders, and their house became the focus of the community. Where they invited in students as well. 2 of those students were Valerie and Frank House from London, who visited Aberdeen as part of an academic conference in 1963, and they later returned to study in Aberdeen and stayed for 5 years when Frank became a lecturer in pharmacology and statistics at the Aberdeen Medical School. So what we see is, one of the reasons that I said earlier was the continued survival of this community, is because of the ability to attract people to Aberdeen, and the two universities and various other industries, particularly the oil and gas industry, was one of the reasons for why Jews came to Aberdeen, also the hospitals as well. Just trying to look through. So
like a 5-minute warning now.
Yep, that's good. I was trying to think about, at one point, I think there were no less than three Jewish helicopter pilots ferrying oil workers back and forth to the rigs. I mean, I've tried, in the book, which was published 2009, that's where I took it up to. Although I've kept abreast of events since, but more from a kind of personal, curious interest rather than an academic one. But as I said, if you want to buy loads of copies of that and get the publisher to ask me to update it, I'd be happy to do it. But what we can see is that, I mean, my perception was from 2004 onwards there was something of a mini revival back then, but things, building aside, and I can be corrected, and I'm only reading through the emails, is that the community seems to have sort of, in a sense, gone from strength to strength in the number of activities it's holding, compared to the activities that were on offer when I was there for albeit 2 years. A book club and visitors, Rabbi Rose coming up quite often and doing the Purim service, and various bar mitzvahs being celebrated and bat mitzvahs in different according to different religious sort of styles, and it's been interesting to follow the community in that sense, in the sense that in the years since I've left, that there's seems to have been quite a lot of activity, at least judging by the email lists, unless they're written for my benefit as the historian, but I don't believe that. So one of the reasons, I think, to sum up, is Aberdeen's, I mean, as I said, I'm intrigued by this. If we, in North Wales, there's one synagogue and it's not owned by the community. Aberdeen is kind of surviving against the odds. And I'd attribute that to two things. One, it's this sort of revolving door community, the ability to attract new people into the area through large employment opportunities on the one hand, but also it doesn't matter how many Jewish people you have in an area, you still need the commitment of a few core families and individuals to keep things going. It's really a tribute to those people over the years who've invested that time and energy in keeping things going, in keeping events and turning up, ringing around, whatever it is they had to do. I mean, one of the tricks I always heard was that if a Jewish man had married out and he wanted a minyan, you rang his wife, and she made sure he turned up. This is one of the anecdotes I was told. So I mean, I suppose I'll get personal here as my conclusion. I have a lot of fondness for Aberdeen, and it's a shame I had to leave, but that was not my fault. That was the then head of school who decided he didn't want to keep me on. But it's nice to see that things have continued, and of which this one event is an example. I think at that point I can try and answer anything I haven't covered, but I think that would be a good place to stop.
Fantastic. So I'm going to unmute you for 2 seconds. This really doesn't work well, but I can unmute you and for you to do a little bit of a clap. There, hang on. Unmute all. Thank you so much. Hang on, I shall unmute Nathan. So I've got a few questions that people have. Am I unmuted? I've got a few questions that people have sent in. So I'll go through them and then we'll take some more questions. So along the way, if you want to just put your hand up if you've got other questions, then Jean, put your real hand up like this, and then Jean will write down who's waiting with questions and let you know afterwards. So first question, the Chief Rabbi was a trustee of Aberdeen Hebrew Community. Have you got any thoughts or background about how that happened? Or anyone else that might know that?
That probably was standard practice, because I think the synagogue is a, I can't remember its exact affiliation status. Obviously isn't part of the United Synagogue officially, but follows it in terms of practice.
Okay.
So I think it's probably standard practice. I have to double check this.
Nathan, can you hear me?
Yes.
It wasn't standard practice. We appear to have been unique. And
Okay.
that's what I can't understand is why the chief rabbi was a trustee when we were not affiliated to the United Synagogue. Gustav Finsk was trained by Leo Beck, so was Reform. And so was Harry Jacobi, who came after Gustav Finsk. So we're at a loss to, you just can't work it out.
Okay. A mystery.
Okay. I'm going to have to say, I'd have to research that one further. I mean, the thing that interests me from observation is, and I've seen this elsewhere, is you're right in pointing out the reform training of some of the rabbis, is that there's this fairly looser practices adopted by smaller communities in terms of trying to maintain a community. I mean, there's a flexibility there for two reasons. One, Jews have got more rigid as we've got closer to the 20th and 21st centuries. So there are practices that Orthodox Jews perhaps would have done then that wouldn't be tolerated by their grandchildren now. So that's just a general kind of move to sort of more stringency that we don't see in the past. But secondly, there's a kind of pragmatic flexibility. If you're going to insist on, full halachic requirements in the more far-flung communities where it's harder to keep a community going, you either go with stringency and don't have a community, or you're a bit more flexible and you allow the community to. I mean, at least when I was there wasn't a mechitza or a partition in the synagogue, which wouldn't be tolerated in any other type of United Synagogue, right? So you do see some flexibility there, and also because the chief rabbis. I'd have to look into this.
Yes. Okay, another question. Did any members of the Jewish community hold public office in Aberdeen, and what contributions did they make to civic life? That could be Nathan, or other people in the room might know.
Well, they all made contributions to civic life. I mean, that's one of the things that Jews all become well integrated. I'm just looking through my notes to see who, offhand, I can't think of public office in Aberdeen. But, Jews don't just keep themselves to themselves in a place like Aberdeen. So they're all contributing, even if it isn't through election or whatnot. But I haven't got in my notes anything about elected officials or that kind of thing.
Okay. And then there's a couple of name checks that you might know, or other people in the room might know. So did you come across the Bittinger bootmakers? Very well to do, were in Aberdeen at the 1911 census, and their daughter Elsa married Mark Wolfe from London in Edinburgh in 1907. This is from Gillian, who's a marriages in Edinburgh expert.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, no, just that they were intriguing because they were obviously doing pretty well, and they got a husband from their daughter from London, which showed, that you had to be doing pretty well to do that. I wondered if they had anything to do with the synagogue. Bittinger was their name, and a lot of them hung around Aberdeen. A lot of them married out, but another one or two married in Edinburgh.
Uh-huh.
I have in my notes, in 1909, Leopold Bittinger won second prize in the Christmas competition of the Balmagal Club. Following year, Louis Bittinger was, his answer to the previous question, was unanimously elected as the candidate for Aberdeen Parish Council.
Yeah.
Ah, very good.
To become the
Yes.
vice chairman of the local ward committee. So yes, that name does ring a bell, actually.
Yes, no, they were obviously pretty well off. I haven't looked out. They lived on on the quay. Oh, no, they had a business on the quayside, bootmaking, and bootmakers were a step up from shoemakers, as far as I could see at that time.
I love the fact of the question will answer the previous question. So here's another question.
Nice.
This question. So somebody came to Aberdeen in 1973, was a student midwife working with an obstetrician called David Abramovich. Was he one of the community?
Well, yeah, there's an interesting thing. One thing I did discover is there's always a discrepancy between the different sort of numbers. So I remember looking at census data, I think it would have been about 2001 then, that said something like there's about 150 Jews of birth in Aberdeen, but 100 who put Jewish as their current religion. So that provides one discrepancy. And then secondly, out of those 100, how many of them went to synagogue, and then how many of them were members? So whilst a name like that would suggest that person was Jewish, I don't have a record of them in my notes here, but that might be because they didn't necessarily, what I have access to is the kind of communities records, rather than the list of every Jewish person that might have been in Aberdeen. So that 150 that the census might have mentioned in 2001.
Yeah, that's always in most towns with small communities. There's like 3 times more Jews in the census than ones that the community knows. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, and then there's those, whether you might pop into synagogue, but you might never become a member, so you're not really on the radar. Yeah.
Another question. Don't know if this would be your ambit. Somebody's interested in levels of anti-Semitism in Aberdeen.
Yeah, I missed that out for time, but I called that section a city of tolerance. So whilst to say that there wasn't none, I don't think the levels were particularly high either. So while we do see some anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic activity in Aberdeen over the years, it's nothing like we've witnessed in other UK cities. I mean, it's probably worse in Dundee, right, than in the 80s than it was in Aberdeen. So I don't want to say there was none, but I don't want to over-exaggerate it either. I mean, I do remember at the time when I was living there, a swastika was sprayed on a bus stop, which I reported. And I remember speaking to the police, and whilst a Jewish person would perceive that as an anti-Semitic hate crime, we don't know whether the person spraying it meant it in that way. So it might not even know what it was. And in these, there's a Welsh goalkeeper who gave a Nazi salute and claimed he'd never heard of the Nazis. So, but yeah, by and large, the record, I'm going to say it's not unblemished, but it's certainly not that of other places.
Yeah. Okay. So if anybody else has got a question, please put your hand up and Jean will note who you are and we'll come back to you. If Jean flicks through the screen to check whether everyone's got their hands up, or else there's a little hand thing below your name in the participants that you can stick up, a little sign. So somebody's saying, and I certainly found this when I first started working for Skojek 10 years ago and came and did research up there. When I used to go to synagogue in Aberdeen, this isn't me, this is someone else saying, when I used to go to synagogue in Aberdeen, there seemed to be several large Israeli families coming to Aberdeen to work in the oil industry. I don't know if that's still the case.
Yeah, I mean, you do see Israelis coming. I don't know about the oil industry. They certainly come. Israeli students would come to study, and there were at least 2 or 3 actually when I was there in 2004, 2006, and also to probably work in either universities or the hospitals. I'm just trying to. I'll have a look through. Whether they're specifically with the oil industry, that I don't know.
So we have one gentleman who's a chef offshore A lot of the Israelis are actually in the university. The mathematicians or computer scientists. Ehud knows most of them, I think. But they tend to come to the non-religious activities. So they come to Purim and Hanukkah, but don't come to regular services and don't tend to come on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. There are exceptions to that rule, but that's basically it. I suppose if you're an Israeli and you're coming to Aberdeen, you're probably not looking for a synagogue, so that's not so surprising. But they do come sometimes.
Might be surprising to find it.
Yeah, bear in mind that my information goes up to, my ethnographic information goes up to 2006 or 2008, and the rest is through email. So people like Mark and Debbie and Hilary and Fiona will have a much better knowledge of what's happened in the last decade than I will. So, did you say was that an Israeli chef? I heard, as in a cook.
Yes, we have a cook who serves on one of the offshore platforms, and he's a very good cook. But that's what he does. He I think he now works 3 weeks on, 2 weeks off. That's fine. And occasionally he comes. And when he does come, it's a bit of a surprise because you think, "Oh, I recognise you." But we have one guy who's a diver. So he comes occasionally when he's not diving. So we have a whole range of mixture of people who work in the oil industry. And we lost families. When we had the big recession a couple of years ago, we lost a lot of families, just left, because there was no longer an expat requirement in the city, so they went home. And that made a really big difference to us. And again, we're going to get hit again this year. So it's really driven by the university now. That seems to be the main attractor of people coming in. And
but when the families left that were related to the oil industry, that meant we lost all our young people. So we have very few young people now, which is real shame.
Yeah. Here's another question that's more historic, more up your street, Nathan. So Evan Becker-Sorsky says, my great-great-grandmother Julia Levy ran the Aberdeen Fishing Company in Leith, Edinburgh. Do you have any information about Jews in the fish trade in Aberdeen?
Yeah, I mentioned what I did know earlier. I'll just, which is the Scotsman reported that during the herring season, Jewish salesmen from Russia who do business at Aberdeen, Peterhead and Fraserburgh augment the resident Jewish community. I haven't come, I mean, you know, I didn't come across, so I'll carry on. In the days before World War I, they were involved with, they're involved in or with the firms that handle the herring trade through Russia, through ports such as Riga, Memel, St. Petersburg and Königsberg. Others may have worked or travelled on the fishing fleets during herring season, including I've one Leon Harris from Galicia. So yeah, that's the information I have on Jews in the fishing trade.
Fab. Okay, so I think we might have come to the end of the questions, and it's been fascinating and a really brilliant start to our set of 3, a very fitting start to our set of 3 talks, focusing so much on the community in Aberdeen and starting off where we need to go on. So maybe we're looking to the next 75 years of Aberdeen community. And this might be the first year of that. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us in these strange times. In these strange times, we seem to be able to do things, you know, there's loads, you know, it's awful and the isolation is horrible, and the fact that we can't get together for events is really horrific. And then what's been happening is that we've been able to have these amazing opportunities with 70 people being able to book in for a talk, 150 people being able to come to a Yiddish open mic, 300 people being able to come from all over the world to a klezmer concert. And so I wouldn't have been able to get you this many in your audience if you'd just come to the shul. So it's lovely. And also you'd have had to have come all the way from Wales. So it's great.
Oh no, I mean, when this is all over, I'd happily do this in person.
Excellent. So it's been fabulous to welcome everybody to this event. We're going to turn off the recording now, and we're going to, and I'll be